The sound of crunching wood echoed through the stillness of the night like a rifle shot. Mason Hunter jerked awake in his ranch house, his heart pounding. For a moment he thought maybe it was just the wind. But then came the laughter, drunken, sharp, and fatting fast as a vehicle tore down the country road. He already knew what he'd find. Slipping on his boots, Mason strode down the gravel path toward the road, a lantern swinging in his hand. Sure enough, the sight waiting for him in the headlights of his old Ford pickup made his jaw clench tight. His mailbox, again, was nothing but a splintered pile, the metal door crumpled and half buried in the ditch. It was the third time that month. Mason sighed, rubbing a hand over his tired face. He, grown up in this part of the county, out past the town where the houses sat wide apart and neighbors minded their own business, or at least they used to. Ever since the new HOA had taken control of the subdivision bordering his land, the peace had vanished. The rules, the fines, the sudden burst of roadwork, no one asked for, Mason had ignored it all. But this was no accident. He crouched, running his calloused fingers over the deep skid marks in the dirt. Whoever they were, they hadn't just clipped it by mistake. They'd lined it up, revved hard, and slammed into it deliberately. The scattered shards of wood around him felt like an insult. Behind him, the ranch house light clicked on. His daughter stood in the doorway in her nightgown, her small frame lit from behind. "Daddy, did they hit it again?" she asked, her voice trembling. Mason forced a steady smile for her sake, even though his blood simmered. "Go back inside, Em, I'll handle it." "But what if they come back?" He looked past her, scanning the road that curved into the dark stretch of woods. He didn't answer. Instead, he walked her back inside, double-locked the door, and kissed the top of her head. "Don't you worry. Tomorrow we'll fix it up again." But as he lay awake later, staring at the ceiling, Mason knew tomorrow's repair would be no different than the last dozen. These weren't kids pulling a prank. This was a pattern, and if it had been at the mailbox when they came barreling down the road. The thought made his stomach knot. Enough was enough. The next morning, Mason loaded the broken pieces into his pickup and drove into town. At the hardware store, the clerk didn't even ask what happened. He just raised his eyebrows and said, "Mailbox again." "Yeah," Mason muttered, "third one this month." "Some folks around here think it's funny," the clerk said. "Had a rancher last year whose mailbox got taken out 6 times. He finally gave up and put in one of those flimsy plastic things. Cheaper that way." Mason's lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't plan on giving up." After checking out, Mason stopped by the HOA office. It was a squat little building on the edge of the subdivision, the kind that tried too hard to look official. Inside, Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, sat behind a polished desk, glasses perched on her nose as she shuffled papers. She looked up with a smile too sweet to be real. "Mr. Hunter, another mailbox issue." "That's right," Mason said, keeping his voice even. "And it's not just kids being careless. Someone's targeting my property. I want it on record, and I want the HOA to do something about it." Karen sighed as if he just asked her to solve world hunger. "Mason, your property is right on the curve. People take it too fast sometimes. It happens." "They're not accidents," he snapped. "You think I don't know the difference?" Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes hardened. "Well, if you build something stronger, just be careful. The HOA has rules about structures that could be hazardous." "Harmful to who?" Mason asked, his voice low. Karen leaned forward, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Sometimes, when people try to send a message, they end up attracting attention they don't want. You understand?" Mason stared at her. It wasn't advice. It was a warning. That night, Mason sat alone on his porch, the broken remains of his mailbox stacked neatly in the truck bed. The crickets chirped, and the stars spread wide across the Texas sky. But his peace was gone. The laughter from the night before still echoed in his ears. His daughter's frightened voice still clung to his heart. If the HOA wouldn't help him, if the county wouldn't care, then he'd solve it himself. And when he did, whoever came tearing down that road next was going to learn real fast. Mason Hunter was done being their joke. The next morning brought a brittle silence to Mason's ranch, broken only by the caw of a crow perched on the broken fence post. Mason had already been up for hours, packing, replaying Karen's words from the day before. They weren't advice. They were a veiled threat. He couldn't shake the look in her eyes, the sharp, calculating glint behind her fake smile. It was the kind of look that told him she knew exactly who was behind the smashed mailboxes, and maybe worse, that she had a hand in it. Came down the stairs as he poured coffee into a chipped mug. "You going to fix it today, Daddy?" she asked. Mason nodded. "Yeah, but not the way they expect." He didn't explain further. He couldn't, not yet. By late afternoon, Mason found himself once again sitting in the HOA's sterile meeting room. Karen had called an emergency session to discuss ongoing disturbances. He knew that meant him. The board sat in a row at a long, folding table, Karen in the center, flanked by two men with stiff ties and self-satisfied smirks. A few neighbors were scattered in the chairs behind Mason, watching the proceedings like it was some kind of show. Karen adjusted her glasses, her voice sugar-coated but sharp. "Mr. Hunter, we understand your frustration regarding the repeated mailbox incidents. However, we must remind you that homeowners are expected to comply with neighborhood standards when replacing any structure." Mason leaned forward. "My mailbox isn't a decoration, Karen. It's my lifeline. My daughter could been out there when those trucks came by. You going to wait until someone gets killed before you take this seriously?" A murmur rippled through the neighbors, but Karen waved a dismissive hand. "We sympathize, of course, but our jurisdiction is limited. If you build a replacement that poses undue risk to drivers, the HOA will have no choice but to fine you." "Undue risk?" Mason scoffed. "What about the risk to us, or does the HOA only care about the people doing the damage?" Karen's smile flickered. "Be careful with your words, Mr. Hunter. I'd hate for you to cause unnecessary conflict in our community." The room went quiet. Mason felt the weight of every pair of eyes on him, half sympathetic, half wary. He realized something in that moment. Karen wasn't warning him out of concern. She was warning him because she was afraid he'd disrupt whatever control she had over this neighborhood. That night Mason couldn't sleep. The old house creaked as the wind pushed against its walls, and soft breathing carried down the hall. Mason sat at the kitchen table, sketching on a yellow notepad. He drew steel beams sunk deep into the ground, reinforcement plates, a concrete base. The outer layer would look like any other mailbox, but inside it would be a fortress, the kind of thing no truck bumper could dent. His pen scratched across the paper, faster as his ideas formed. This wasn't just a mailbox anymore. This was a statement. But as he worked, headlights flashed across the window. Mason froze, listening. An engine slowed outside, rumbling low. He killed the lamp and crept to the window. A black pickup crawled past his driveway, then stopped in front of the demolished mailbox post. Two figures leaned out the window, one pointing, the other laughing. Mason's gut tightened. Then, as if sensing him watching, one of them turned. In the glow of the dashboard, Mason caught a glimpse of a familiar face. His stomach dropped. It was Carl, the same Carl who sat on the HOA board earlier that day. The truck rolled away, dust trailing in the moonlight, leaving Mason's heart pounding. So that was it. Karen wasn't just indifferent, she was protecting her own people. The HOA wasn't some innocent neighborhood club, it was shielding the very vandals terrorizing him. He sat back down at the table, gripping his pen hard enough to snap it. This wasn't about a mailbox anymore. It was about power, intimidation, and sending a message. Fine, Mason thought grimly. If they wanted a message, he'd give them one they'd never forget. The black pickup's taillights had barely vanished down the road before Mason was grabbing his jacket and boots. Sleep wasn't an option, not after what he'd just seen. Carl, HOA treasurer, family man, the one who always preached about community values during the meetings. And yet there he was, laughing like a hyena while circling Mason's destroyed mailbox. Mason's gut told him this wasn't just a neighbor with too much beer in his belly. No, Carl was part of something bigger, something tied to Karen and the rest of the HOA board. By midnight, Mason sat in his darkened pickup a quarter-mile down the road, engine off, binoculars in hand. The night was cold, the silence broken only by the chirp of crickets and the occasional owl. He kept his lights out, waiting. For almost an hour, nothing, just the empty country road stretching beneath the stars. Then, faint at first, came the low growl of engines. 2 sets of headlights crested the hill, weaving slightly as they barreled toward his property. Mason leaned forward, heart hammering. The truck slowed as they neared his land, rolling almost silently until they stopped right at the edge of his ditch. Mason's knuckles tightened around the binoculars. He recognized the first truck, Carl's black pickup. The second was an older red Chevy he didn't recognize. The drivers killed their engines. For a long moment there was only silence. Then came laughter, low, mocking. Mason adjusted the binoculars. He could see Carl in the driver's seat, talking to the other man, his hands gesturing toward Mason's broken post like he was giving a tour. Mason strained his ears. The voices carried faintly through the night. "Told you he'd complain to Karen," Carl chuckled. The other man laughed. "She'll shut him up, always does, no one gets around her." Mason's stomach turned cold. So Karen knew. She wasn't just tolerating the vandalism, she was orchestrating the cover-up. Carl went on, his voice sharper now. "He's stubborn, though. If he builds something heavy, he'll regret it. You saw what happened to Miller's cousin. One crash and he was." Carl made a smashing sound with his hands. Both men laughed harder. Mason's jaw clenched. They weren't just talking about accidents. They were admitting to wrecks, injuries, maybe worse. The men eventually started their engines again, the sound echoing through the trees as they sped off down the road. Mason sat frozen, fists balled, every nerve in his body lit with fury. Back at the ranch, Mason paced his kitchen until dawn. He couldn't tell, she'd only grow more afraid. But he also couldn't ignore what he'd overheard. The HOA wasn't just corrupt, they were dangerous. When shuffled into the kitchen, rubbing her eyes, she found her father hunched over a legal pad covered in new sketches. "Daddy," she asked softly, "are you making another mailbox?" Mason gave her a tired smile. "Something like that, sweetheart, but this one's going to be different." She tilted her head. "Different how?" He hesitated, then patted her shoulder. "Different enough that no one will ever dare touch it again." Later that day, Mason stopped by his friend Ray's welding shop on the outskirts of town. Ray, a burly man with a soot-streaked beard, raised his eyebrows when Mason rolled in with a truck bed full of scrap steel. "You finally building that fortress mailbox you always joked about," Ray teased. Mason's expression stayed hard, not a joke this time. Ray's grin faded. "What happened?" Mason glanced around before answering. "Let's just say the HOA isn't as innocent as they pretend, and I'm tired of playing defense." Ray studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, you want steel, I'll cut steel, but if you're aiming to make a statement, better be ready for the blowback." Mason met his gaze. "I've been ready since the night my daughter almost got hit out there." That evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky flared orange, Mason unloaded heavy beams and plates onto his gravel drive. He worked until sweat poured from his brow, until his muscles ached, until the first pieces of his design stood upright in the ground. To anyone passing by, it would just look like a man replacing his mailbox again. But to Mason, it was the beginning of something else. The start of a war. The clang of metal rang out across the ranch yard like church bells calling a congregation. Mason's sledgehammer struck again, driving a steel post deep into the ground. Sweat stung his eyes, but he didn't stop. The bones of his fortress mailbox were taking shape, steel ribs sunk in concrete, a frame tough enough to withstand anything short of a tank. Each strike was a promise, to his daughter, to himself, to anyone who thought they could run him off. By dusk, the skeleton of the structure stood upright, rough but menacing. To a casual driver, it was just another mailbox waiting to be finished. But Mason knew the truth. Inside that frame was a wall of reinforced steel, a hidden beast disguised in plain sight. As he packed up his tools, headlights appeared at the far end of the road. Mason froze, watching. A sleek silver SUV slowed as it approached. The window rolled down, and out leaned none other than Karen. She smiled that same politician's smile, the kind that never touched her eyes. "Mr. Hunter," she called sweetly, "burning the midnight oil are we." Mason wiped his brow with the back of his hand. "Replacing what your people broke." Karen's eyes flicked to the steel frame. Her smile faltered for the briefest second. "My, that looks sturdy." "Stronger than the last 10, Mason replied. His voice was flat, heavy with challenge. Karen's tone softened, but her words were edged. "Be careful. The HOA has regulations about structures that could cause unnecessary harm. We wouldn't want a tragic accident on our hands." Mason stepped closer, resting one boot on the gravel shoulder. "The only accident here would be someone stupid enough to hit this one, but maybe that's the point. Maybe it's time they thought twice." Karen's smile vanished entirely. She leaned out the window, her voice low and sharp. "You think you're untouchable because you live out here on the edge? You're not. The HOA has ways of dealing with problems, Mason, and right now you're looking more and more like a problem." Her SUV purred as she rolled up the window and drove off, taillights glowing like the eyes of some predator slipping back into the woods. That night Mason lay awake in bed, listening to the wind scrape against the siding. Every creak of the house made him tense. Karen's words echoed in his head. The HOA has ways of dealing with problems. He got up, padded quietly to the living room, and checked his rifle by the door. Loaded, ready. He poured himself a glass of water and stood by the window, staring out at the half-finished mailbox shining faintly in the moonlight. It looked like a sentinel, silent, unyielding, waiting for the fight. And Mason knew the fight was coming. The next morning padded into the kitchen as Mason packed his thermos. "Daddy, are we safe here?" she asked softly. Mason crouched in front of her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "We're safer every day I work on that mailbox," he said firmly. "And when it's finished, nobody will ever hurt us here again." She nodded, though her wide eyes told him she wasn't convinced. At Ray's welding shop later that day, Mason explained the rest of his plan. Ray whistled low as Mason sketched. "This isn't just a mailbox, Mason. This is a barricade." "That's the idea," Mason said. "It's not about mail anymore, it's about sending a message." Ray's brow furrowed. "You're playing with fire. If Karen and her boys are behind this, they won't let it slide. They'll push back." Mason's eyes burned with resolve. "Then let them push. I'm done backing down." Ray studied him for a long moment before finally nodding. "All right, I'll help, but if we're doing this, we're doing it right." By sundown, the two men were back at the ranch, welding sparks flying as they fitted plates into the frame. The air smelled of hot steel and determination. Watched from the porch, clutching her stuffed rabbit, her eyes wide with awe and fear. Piece by piece, the mailbox fortress grew, a hulking beast of iron wrapped in the disguise of painted wood. To any outsider, it would look like just another rural mailbox, but hidden inside was a machine designed to stop any truck dead in its tracks. Mason wiped his face, staring at the nearly finished project. "Tomorrow," he muttered, "tomorrow they'll see." That night, as the cicadas screamed and the stars hung heavy over the ranch, Mason sat on the porch with his rifle across his lap. He wasn't waiting for the mailman. He was waiting for the wolves. And deep down, he almost hoped they came. The night Mason finished welding the final plate, a storm rolled in. Thunder cracked across the sky, lightning flashed over the hills, and rain hammered the ranch like the heavens were cleansing the land. Mason stood in his slicker coat, staring at his creation, the fortress mailbox gleaming wet under the storm's fury. It stood tall and unyielding, bolted into the concrete foundation like a knight holding its ground. On the outside, it looked like an ordinary mailbox painted hunter green to blend in with the others along the road. But Mason knew the truth. Inside, it was steel and fire, an immovable wall. He felt something he hadn't in weeks, satisfaction. For the first time since the attacks began, he wasn't afraid. He was ready. The rain tapered off after midnight, and the silence returned, heavy and tense. Mason sat on the porch, rifle across his lap, his eyes on the road. was safe inside, tucked into bed, the storm masking the fact that her father hadn't slept in days. At first, the night seemed still, too still, then came the sound. Engines. Mason's heart thumped. Headlights crested the hill, twin beams cutting through the mist, then another set, and another, 3 trucks in total rumbling toward his ranch. He rose slowly, gripping the rifle. "Showtime," he whispered. The trucks slowed as they approached his mailbox. Their high beams flooded the structure, shadows dancing across the wet gravel. Mason's stomach clenched. He knew what was coming. The lead truck revved its engine, tires squealing. With a roar, it launched forward, aiming straight for the mailbox. The impact shook the night. Steel screamed, tires burst, and the front end of the truck crumpled like paper against Mason's creation. The driver's head snapped forward, his horn blaring as his face smashed into the wheel. The entire vehicle shuddered to a stop, its engine hissing, hood folded in half. The other trucks skidded to a halt, their headlights illuminating the carnage. Mason stepped off the porch, rain still dripping from the eaves, his rifle gleaming under the light. One of the men jumped out of the second truck, shouting, "What the hell, Carl? You all right?" "Carl?" So it was him. The driver groaned, slumping in the seat, blood trailing down his temple. The others swore, packing, throwing nervous glances up toward Mason's house. Mason raised the rifle, his voice cutting through the night like thunder. "That's what happens when you bring war to my property." The men froze, caught between rage and fear. One of them barked back, "You'll pay for this, Hunter. You think you can just—" A single shot cracked the air. Mason fired into the dirt inches from the man's boots, the bullet spitting gravel against his jeans. "I've had enough warnings," Mason growled. "Get him out of here before I decide to finish what you started." The men scrambled, dragging Carl out of the mangled truck and shoving him into another. Engines roared as the 2 surviving trucks peeled away, leaving the ruined pickup abandoned at the foot of Mason's fortress mailbox. For a long moment, silence reigned again. The mailbox stood untouched, unbent, gleaming in the headlights of the wreck. Mason lowered his rifle, his breath finally releasing. He had won the first strike. By morning, word had spread. Neighbors gathered at the edge of Mason's property, whispering, gawking at the destroyed truck and the mailbox that hadn't so much as chipped. Peeked out from behind Mason's leg, wide-eyed as people murmured about the indestructible mailbox. "Thing's a tank," one man muttered. "Hunter's gonna bring the whole HOA down on him now," another whispered. Corinne arrived last. Her silver SUV pulled up, her face a mask of controlled fury. She stepped out, heels clicking against the gravel as she inspected the wreck. Then she turned her icy gaze to Mason. "Do you realize what you've done?" she hissed. "This is assault, property destruction. You could be arrested." Mason crossed his arms. "Funny, didn't hear you complaining when it was my property getting destroyed every week." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "You've made a dangerous enemy, Mason. The HOA doesn't forget." Mason met her glare unflinching. "Neither do I." That night, after the crowds dispersed and the sheriff hauled away Carl's ruined truck, Mason sat on his porch again. His rifle lay across his knees, but he wasn't smiling. Because deep down, he knew this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. The following morning dawned pale and gray, like the sky itself was holding its breath. Mason sipped black coffee on the porch, staring at the mailbox standing tall and unbroken, its steel core hidden beneath chipped green paint. The mangled truck had been hauled away in the night, but the scars remained. Skid marks, broken glass, oil stains darkening the gravel. Stepped outside, rubbing her eyes. "Daddy, did we win?" she asked. Mason gave her a tired smile. "We won the battle, war's not over yet." By mid-morning, dust kicked up on the horizon. A sheriff's cruiser rolled down the lane, its lights flashing but sirens silent. Mason set his mug aside and rose, jaw tightening. Sheriff Dalton climbed out, a heavy-set man with a weathered face and tired eyes. He adjusted his hat, looked at the mailbox, then back at Mason. "Morning, Hunter." "Morning, Sheriff," Mason said evenly. "What brings you out here?" Dalton sighed. You know why I'm here. Karen filed a complaint. Mason let out a bitter laugh. Of course she did. She claims you set up a dangerous obstruction that caused serious injury to a homeowner. An obstruction? Mason barked. That mailbox was on my property. Carl drove a truck into it on purpose. If he got hurt, that's on him. Dalton rubbed his temple. I don't disagree, but the HOA's pushing hard. Karen's got half the board signing affidavits saying your mailbox violates neighborhood safety codes. They want me to issue a citation. Mason stepped closer, voice low. And what do you want, Sheriff? Dalton met his gaze for a long moment, then sighed. I want peace in this county. You've been here long enough to know how it works. Karen's family's got money, influence. You keep pushing and they'll drag this all the way to court, maybe further. Peeked out from behind the screen door. Is he gonna take Daddy away? Dalton's face softened. No, sweetheart, not today. Mason put a hand on her shoulder. Go on inside, Em. It's grown-up talk. She lingered for a moment before retreating, the door creaking shut behind her. Mason turned back to Dalton. I'm not tearing it down. Dalton exhaled slowly. I figured you'd say that. Just watch your back, Hunter. Karen's not used to losing. With that, the sheriff tipped his hat, climbed back into his cruiser, and rolled away, leaving Mason alone with the humming of cicadas and the weight of a new threat. That afternoon, Mason went into town for supplies. As he walked out of the hardware store with bags of bolts and paint, he noticed eyes following him. People whispered. Some nodded in support, others looked away nervously. At the feed store, old man Cooper leaned on his cane, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. Heard you gave Carl a new hood ornament last night, he said with a grin. Mason smirked, more like a new headache. Cooper chuckled, then his tone sobered. Be careful, son. Folks like Karen don't fight fair. They'll smile to your face and gut you from behind. Mason nodded grimly. I'm counting on it. When he returned home, he found a manila envelope taped to his front door. The HOA logo was stamped across the front. He tore it open, his pulse quickening. Notice of violation. Fine $5,000. Deadline for removal, 14 days. At the bottom, Karen's signature looped in perfect cursive, as if she'd taken pleasure in every stroke of the pen. Mason crumpled the letter in his fist. So this is how she wants to play. That night he spread the letter on the kitchen table, smoothing the creases, sat across from him, coloring with her crayons, humming softly. Mason watched her for a moment, his anger hardening into resolve. They could fine him, they could threaten him, but they couldn't scare him. He pulled out his notepad and began sketching again. If they thought the fortress mailbox was the end of his fight, they were wrong. It was just the beginning. Just past midnight, Mason heard it again, the low growl of an engine creeping down the road. He slipped onto the porch, rifle in hand, heart hammering. But this time the truck didn't stop at his mailbox. It kept rolling, slow and deliberate, before turning into the shadows of the neighbor's drive. Mason frowned, his stomach sinking. This wasn't about smashing mailboxes anymore. The HOA was expanding the battlefield. Mason rose before dawn, restless, the HOA's violation letter still burning in his mind. But when he stepped outside, coffee mug in hand, he froze. 2 houses down, his neighbor's mailbox lay in splinters, the post ripped clean from the ground. Shards of wood scattered across the roadside, tire tracks carved deep into the ditch. And in the gray light, he saw more. 3 other neighbors had suffered the same fate. It wasn't random, it was a message. By mid-morning, the neighborhood buzzed like a hornet's nest. Families stood at the roadside, shaking their heads, voices low and tense. Mason joined them, his boots crunching on gravel. Yours too? Asked Mrs., a widow who lived across the way. She looked pale, clutching her robe tight against the morning chill. Mason nodded grimly. Not last night, but looks like they hit nearly everyone else. A younger man from the corner lot threw his hands up. This is insane. I called Karen first thing and she said the HOA, looking into it. These guys could killed somebody. That name, Karen, hung in the air like poison. She doesn't care, Mason said flatly. In fact, I'd bet money she's behind it. When they couldn't scare me, they decided to punish all of you. Some of the neighbors exchanged uncertain glances. It was one thing for Mason to declare war on Karen. It was another for the whole neighborhood to face her wrath. Mrs. Slip trembled. What are we supposed to do, Mr. Hunter? They fined me last year because my shutters were the wrong shade of beige. If I stand up to her now, I'll lose my house. Mason clenched his fists. The injustice of it made his blood boil, but before he could answer, a familiar voice cut through the murmurs. Sheriff Dalton's cruiser rolled up and he climbed out, hat pulled low. "Morning, folks," he called. His eyes swept the wreckage, his jaw tightening. "Looks like the trouble's spreading." Snapped, "What are you gonna do about it, Sheriff? Or is Karen paying you to look the other way, too?" Dalton's face darkened. "Careful, son, I don't take sides," he looked at Mason. "Not officially." The subtle weight of his words landed. Mason nodded slightly. Dalton couldn't move against Karen openly, but he wasn't blind either. Later that afternoon, Mason found himself hosting an impromptu gathering in his barn. The smell of hay and oil lingered as neighbors filled the space, their voices tense but determined. Leaned on a post, arms crossed. "We can't keep letting her do this. If we stand together, she can't fine all of us, right?" Mrs. wrung her hands. "But what if she tries? What if she sends the bank after me?" "That's exactly how she wins," Mason said, his voice low but steady. "She counts on fear. She's got the HOA bylaws twisted in her pocket, but they only work if we let her isolate us. If we stick together, we take away her leverage." A murmur of agreement rippled through the group. "But what about the trucks?" another neighbor asked. "They're not just breaking mailboxes anymore. What if they start breaking bones?" Mason glanced at his fortress mailbox through the barn's open door, gleaming in the late afternoon sun. His jaw set. "Then we make sure they regret it." That night, Mason and set up watch along the road. They parked an old tractor across a side lane, lanterns dim, rifles at the ready. The air was heavy with crickets and the distant howl of coyotes. Hours dragged by. Midnight passed. Then came the sound, low, rolling engines cutting through the stillness. Headlights appeared, 3 sets again, moving slow, deliberate. Mason felt the old surge of adrenaline as they crept closer. But this time something changed. The trucks didn't head for Mason's mailbox. Instead, they swerved towards freshly rebuilt one, the lead truck accelerating like a predator closing in. Mason's eyes narrowed, not tonight. He raised his rifle and fired, not at the truck but at the ground in front of it. Gravel exploded, the shot echoing through the night. The truck screeched to a halt, engines rumbling, brake lights glowing red. Shouted, "They're running!" as the truck spun around, tires spitting mud, disappearing into the darkness. The 2 men stood panting, hearts racing, the night silent once more. Back at the barn, Mason found the neighbors waiting anxiously, lanterns casting long shadows. He told them what happened, and for the first time he saw fire in their eyes instead of fear. "They're cowards," said firmly. "They only win if we hide." Mrs. nodded. "Then we don't hide." Mason looked around the room at faces young and old, tired but resolute. He felt something stir in his chest, a glimmer of hope. Karen wanted to divide them. Instead, she had created an army. Later, as Mason walked upstairs to bed, she asked in a whisper, "Are we safe now?" Mason tucked the blanket around her shoulders and kissed her forehead. "Not yet," he said softly, "but soon." Because tomorrow, the real fight would begin. The next HOA meeting was supposed to be routine, the kind where Karen prattled on about lawn lengths and acceptable wreath colors. But this time, the community hall was packed wall-to-wall, tension thick enough to choke on. Mason stood near the back, arms crossed, watching as neighbors whispered nervously, gave him a nod of solidarity. Mrs. clutched her folder of fines like a shield. Everyone was tired of broken mailboxes, of fear of Karen. At the front of the room, Karen adjusted her pearls and tapped the microphone. "Order, please," she said in her syrupy, condescending tone. Before we begin, I must address a matter of grave concern, namely, the reckless and illegal actions of one Mason Hunter. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Mason didn't flinch, he expected this. Karen lifted a thick binder, slapping it on the table with theatrical force. Here are documented violations: constructing an unsafe mailbox, discharging a firearm within HOA limits, and inciting hostility among residents. The board is moving to impose fines totaling $5,000, Mason cut in, his voice steady. Already tried that? Karen's smile tightened. It will be 10 now, and if you fail to comply, we'll pursue foreclosure proceedings on your ranch. You'll lose everything. The room buzzed with whispers. Karen basked in their fear, mistaking it for power. Mason let the silence stretch before he spoke again. That binder of yours, how many of those violations are against me, and how many are against the people in this room? Karen's smile faltered. Mrs. fined because her shutters were off color, fined because his truck was unsightly. The Johnsons fined for planting tomatoes in their own yard. Mason's voice rose with each example. You've been bleeding this community dry for years, hiding behind rules you twisted to suit yourself. A murmur of agreement swelled into open voices. Karen banged her gavel, panic flashing in her eyes. Order, I demand order. But Mason wasn't finished. He reached into his coat and pulled out a manila envelope. The same kind Karen had used to deliver her threats, but this one had the seal of the state attorney general's office. Gasps filled the hall. Mason opened the envelope and laid out copies of official documents. While you were busy sending fines, I was busy sending evidence. Fraudulent citations, selective enforcement, embezzlement of HOA funds, all of it. And now the state has it too. Karen's face went pale. The back doors of the hall creaked open. Sheriff Dalton walked in, flanked by 2 suited investigators. The room went dead silent. Karen, Dalton said, his voice carrying across the hall. You're under investigation for misuse of association funds and intimidation of residents. Karen shot to her feet, sputtering. This is outrageous, you can't. One of the investigators held up a warrant. We can. As they stepped forward, Karen's composure shattered. She shrieked, pointing at Mason. This is his doing, he's the troublemaker, he's dangerous. But no one listened. The neighbors she had bullied for years now watched with grim satisfaction as the sheriff escorted her out, her protests echoing uselessly against the walls. After the chaos settled, clapped Mason on the shoulder. Never thought I'd see the day. Mrs. wiped tears from her eyes. You saved us, Mr. Hunter, you really did. Mason shook his head. We saved ourselves, all it took was standing together. The neighbors applauded. Not just for him, but for each other, for their victory, for their reclaimed dignity. Later that night, back at the ranch, Mason stood on the porch with. The mailbox gleamed in the moonlight, tall and unbroken. For the first time in months, the road was quiet. Daddy asked softly, is it over now? Mason knelt beside her, pulling her close. The worst of it is, Karen won't be bothering us anymore. Smiled sleepily, resting her head against his shoulder. Mason let the night air fill his lungs. For once it felt clean. But as he carried upstairs and turned out the lights, he didn't notice the envelope tucked inside his mailbox. No stamp, no name, just a single sheet of paper, the words scrawled in jagged handwriting. Karen was just the beginning. Mason's gut tightened as he read it under the porch light. Somewhere in the distance, an engine revved, then faded into the night. The war wasn't over. It had only changed hands. And Mason Hunter was ready.